Next on our agenda, Ms. Lautner. I think you're up next to the podium. Oh, and Dr. Rysewyk, are you going to take the podium as well?
All right, Madam Chair, members of the board, last month, if you recall, we had a pretty good discussion around data usage in the district and some very specific conversations around how are we using our data, what are we using our data to help inform, and specifically, what are we looking at as it relates to discipline data. And so this evening, in response to some of the requests that we received last month, we'd like to do three things with you all. First, take a look at our data points that are available in the district, how we are using those data points to improve student outcomes, and finally spend some time contextualizing the discipline data that's at our disposal and how we are using that on a regular basis as well. And so with that in mind, I want to start by talking a little bit about what we monitor and what we report on. There's some crossover here, but there is some difference. So what we're monitoring on a regular basis at the district level are what we can call indicators of success. So these are metrics that are used to predict outcomes or assess the impact our strategies or our initiatives are having on the learning taking place in the classroom. Now the crosswalk there is that we're predicting the outcomes we plan to report on as a result of the objectives that we've set for ourselves in our annual action plan. So some examples of those indicators of success could include anything from benchmark data. So those are some of those predictive assessments our students are taking over the course of their year. We're looking at whether or not students are on track for proficiency in ELA and math and science and all of those testable areas. We're looking at walkthrough data. What are we seeing in our classrooms? Are we seeing what we expect? If we're not, are we deploying supports to get ourselves back on track so that we can see what we expect to see or what we would like to see in those classroom areas? We're looking at behavior. What's happening in our students' lives? What trends are we seeing, and are we intervening appropriately to make sure that students have every opportunity to remain in the classroom and to continue to reap the benefit of the instruction that's taking place in that space? And so, as we are monitoring, we're monitoring with the intention of meeting some very specific objectives. We've established those objectives for ourselves through the annual action plan, that board-adopted document, at the beginning of every year. And so we use that annual action plan to define what at the district level we need and want to be true to continue to move forward, to continue to improve outcomes for our students. And so that's what we're reporting on an annual basis. And you'll hear in just a moment that beginning this year, we'd actually like to begin reporting on our progress made around that document on a biannual basis. So you'll actually start hearing more from us beginning this year in regard to those measurable and milestone objectives that we've established for ourselves. Before we do that, I want to ask a big question. And I feel like this should be kind of obvious, but when we're talking about data, an obvious question to ask is why monitor data, right? The easy answer is that we have to. There are multiple state and federal grants and laws that require ongoing and regular data monitoring and reporting on metrics that include anything from chronic absenteeism to third grade ELA proficiency to our participation rate in the ACT to our graduation rates throughout the district. That's the we have to answer, and that's a valid answer. But more deeply than that, we're monitoring data on a regular basis because we want to. So at KCS, we want to monitor data because we're using those data points to drive real-time decisions in our classroom, in our district, in our schools to help meet our established objectives and to make sure that students are learning and they're meeting their own goals that they've established for themselves. All right, so big question. How do we use data to improve student outcomes? First and foremost, as with everything else that we do, this should look really familiar by now, we are using our data that we have at our disposal through the lens of our 4 priorities. We're making sure that we are monitoring those indicators of success as they relate to excellence in foundational skills, to great educators in every school, to career empowerment and preparation, and for success for every student, so that we can make sure that we are on track to meet our goal of graduating every student in the district ready to succeed in the future of their choosing be that through enrollment in a post-secondary institution, enlistment in the military, or employment in a high-wage, high-demand career field. At Knox County Schools, I will say that we are uniquely fortunate to exist in such a data-rich environment. So we have a pretty vast data ecosystem. We have a ton of data points at our disposal, and we have a lot of data users throughout the district. So on a daily basis, anyone from our superintendent of schools, Dr. Rysewyk, to our district leadership team, to our regional directors and supervisors, to our principals and their school teams, to our teachers in the classroom and our students in their desk, are using data on a regular basis to identify goals for themselves, track whether or not they're en route to meet those goals, and then reflect on whether or not they met those goals and how or why. So when we exist in such a data-rich environment, one thing we have to consider is that there's also this potential for noise. And so data without context, it's just a dot, right? It's just noise. So one of the goals of both the strategy division and also one of our goals here today is to connect those dots, to make sure that we are putting the most actionable, most relevant data points in front of the most appropriate users to make sure that we are moving the needle to meet those established goals. And it starts to sound really nebulous without examples, so we're going to get into some examples. Speaking of, we're really looking at connecting the dots, connecting our data users to data points at 3 levels throughout the district. So we're talking about the district level, we're talking about the school level, but we're also talking about what's happening at the student level. So if we start at the district level first, our primary data users are probably our superintendent of schools, Dr. Rysewyk, and our district leadership team. Our district leadership team consists of the 5 assistant superintendents and all of our direct reports. So on a regular basis, we are looking at some pretty high-level data points to assess kind of the overall health and well-being and status of the district. That could be anything from staffing data. Where are vacancies? Are we seeing hotspots? Are we seeing areas that are difficult to fill? If we are our retention and recruitment efforts working? Once we fill vacancies, is that fill rate sustaining? So what are we seeing in that staffing data space? We're looking at student outcomes data. So are the initiatives that we're funding, are the strategies that we're leveraging meeting the goals they were intended to make or to meet? We're also looking at facilities data and whether or not our infrastructure, our built environment is where it needs to be to support the learning that's taking place in the classroom. Are there major capital expenditures that we anticipate, that we're planning for, and that we're ready for? And so this isn't the only data that we're looking at the district level, but it does give you kind of a snapshot and an example of the type of data points that we're looking at the district level with a very specific intent of driving our budgeting and resourcing decisions. That's a very relevant conversation right now. With the intent of looking at the strategies that we're using. Is it time to pilot something new? Is it time to discontinue something else? We're looking at that data to drive our staffing decisions, and we're doing all of this with the intent of improving outcomes for students. If we drill down a level deeper to our school data, we're talking about data users at the regional level. Those would be our regional directors, our regional supervisors, their regional instructional teams, so those content facilitators, our school culture facilitators, our HR liaisons, our ELA, our math, our science, our ELL facilitators who are all working to support schools. We're talking about our principals, and they're looking at, on a regular basis, everything from benchmark data, those predictive assessments. Are students on track? Are we seeing the right rate of skill acquisition to put students on a path toward proficiency in a given content area? We're looking at that walkthrough data. Are we seeing the materials usage that we would anticipate in the classroom? Are we hearing the types of questions that we want to hear in the classroom? Are we seeing the level of engagement we want to see in the classroom? We're looking at discipline data. So what's happening at a school level? Are there areas of concern? Do we see a whole lot of concern in a cafeteria in a given school? And if so, have we moved staff to that area to help supervise that space? So we're looking at these very I wouldn't say high-level data points, but higher-level data points than what you're going to see at the classroom level to diagnose what's happening at the school level. Is every school in the best possible position to meet their established goals, to drive support and intervention? Do we need to deploy some district-level supports to specific schools? Do schools need to reallocate some of their building-level supports to specific classrooms? What are we doing in the intervention space? Are there scheduling decisions that need to be made? If we see an uptick in need for some RTI time in a classroom, if we see a lot of students in need of some small group intervention, do we need to make some changes to the master schedule next year to allow for more capacity to provide for that intervention time? So all of these school level decisions are, again, and this is the constant theme, being made to drive and improve student outcomes. And we can drill even deeper. So if we go one level deeper, we land at the student level data. And this is really where we see the most room for impact, right? This is, these are data users consisting of our school teams. So that's everything from our PLCs, our professional learning communities who are looking specifically at content in the classroom, to our SLCs, our small learning communities. Those of you who are familiar with the 865 Academy's work know that these are teams of teachers who are wrapping around students, making sure students aren't falling through the tracks, or through the cracks, who's disengaged, who hasn't been to class in a while, who's really struggling in math but maybe doing a great job in English and just needs a little word of support. These are our whole child support teams. You're going to hear a lot about those in just a moment, who are looking at, are there barriers to learning? What obstacles or challenges are our students facing that we can help mitigate, that we can help bridge the gap for so that students are ready and able to learn when they walk into the classroom? We're talking about our teachers. We're talking about our students also looking at data in real time in the classroom to make some very real, very tangible, very relevant decisions around their own instruction and their own learning in the classroom. So the types of data points they're using are everything from grades on pop quizzes, informal assessments, tests, to behavior trends. Is someone just having a really rough week, and maybe do they need a little extra support, or an opportunity to kind of just unpack with somebody outside of the classroom space? They're looking at attendance data. Do we have a student that maybe has missed the exact same block of instruction for 2 weeks in a row now? And what are we doing to make sure that we can bridge that gap to get that student back in front of the instruction and the learning that we want to be taking place, that we want that student to have access to? So we're using all of that student level data to drive a lot of the same things, but in a very specific way at the school and the classroom level in particular, to drive instruction, to drive support and intervention specifically for our individual students. And we're looking at that classroom and student level decision making to, once again, and most relevantly here, drive and impact student outcomes. So that's a very, very quick sprint through the various layers of data that we are using on a regular basis and who's engaging with those data points on a regular basis. I could start putting a lot of bar graphs up on the screen, but we'd be here for a very long time. We're going to look at some very specific data points here in just a minute. But before we do that, I do just want to come back to reporting on our progress, because we've at least tried to be very intentional in what it is we're reporting on and when we're reporting on that progress. So some of these needles don't move as quickly as others. When we're talking about benchmark data and we're talking about academic learning, you may see some changes on a quarterly basis, but you're not necessarily seeing changes that are comparable from one quarter to the next. So when we're really talking about reporting on results, the best cadence we've been able to land on is a semesterly reporting structure. So beginning last year, early this year actually, we published our very first annual report. And so this was our report out on those milestone and measurable objectives that we set for ourselves in the annual that you all approved for us in the annual action plan. This year, we would like to report out at a slightly more frequent cadence. So in addition to publishing an annual report on our results in October, next month, we would like to bring you a progress report on the strategies that we are using, on whether or not, we're on track in all of our established goals, whether or not we're a little bit off track, and if we are, what are we doing about it right now? And so you all can be on the lookout for that first progress report from us next month, and then we will follow with our second edition of the KCS annual report in October. And part of what inspired, I believe, this conversation last month was this question around discipline data. What do we have? What are we using? How does it fit into how we're moving the needle and supporting the learning that's taking place in our classrooms? And so that's not a very quick answer to unpack, but it is an answer that we wanted to tackle here today. So I'm briefly going to turn it back over to Dr. Rysewyk to talk a little bit about his philosophy as it relates to discipline.
Thank you, ma'am. It's different from this seat.
I was going to say, is it weird for you?
I know it is, and I'm like, now I have to click and everything on my own. But no, I just want to say, conversations about discipline, they're not new to me. As a lifelong educator in the classroom, I know everybody thinks I've been a superintendent working in a district office forever, but I know, John, your kids were at school at Austin when I was at Fulton. So, once upon a time, like I was a teacher, I was a principal, and all of that shaped who I am today. All of that shaped how I now as the CEO running from the superintendent way I think about things. So it's very important to me, and so discipline is something that I care a lot about. And just kind of looking through the story, some people may not know this. So I was the principal at Fulton in 2006. We had a lot of work to do when I got there. I was an assistant principal. Moved into quickly in the first year and a half to the head principal spot when our principal took a medical leave of absence. And what you see under the 2006 slide is what I inherited. So we had a 43.6% graduation rate, almost 1,100 suspensions at that point, and we're facing state takeover. That's where we were. The state had given us a few choices on what we could do. District made the choice to go through a reconstitution at that point. That was one of the three choices that we had. So through 2006 to 2011, we did a lot of work. We did a lot of work as a staff. I can still remember even as an assistant principal there. We were able to set up these kind of vision committees, and everybody was on one. What are we going to do to try to solve this thing? How are we going to do better for kids, and look through those processes? So one thing that we went to is we went to small learning communities. We tried to make big small. This probably sounds familiar, right? I told you everything we do is informed by my past and looking at those things. And it's not just a guess or a trial or a pilot. Like, I know this works, okay? Like, I've done it. I've walked it. I've lived it. And so we went through that, raised expectations for kids. We also went through having teaming, kind of what you're seeing now in the 865 academies, and we're going to talk about in the whole child supports now. We went to that. We had teams of teachers teaching kids. We didn't teach subjects, we taught kids, right? We went around and looked at the data. We had small SLC meetings where they talked about the best strategy, who had the best relationship, where do we need to challenge kids more. Over that span of time in those 5 years, we actually worked with Stanford University. They didn't bring us any strategies. That's not what they were doing. Their job was to come on the ground and kind of do a case study of what we were doing as we started seeing movement. I still remember every time they would come in, they would do a focus group with different kids, and we didn't know who it was going to be. They'd ask us before they flew in. And one year they said, we're going to talk to your junior AP English class. I had one of them. I'm like, okay, so we'll do it. So the kids went in there, and we're expecting all this different kind of information. What they came out with, and they debriefed us afterwards, were we can do more. We've not been held to high expectations. Our teachers could actually ask us to do more, which was great for us. I mean, these are AP kids, right, in our school. So what I realized through that whole process, kind of end of the stories, fast forward to 2011, our grad rate was almost 82% higher than the state average. But notice that bottom number. Our suspension rate over 50% improvement on our suspension rate, right? What we saw was more kids graduating, more kids engaged, and the lesson for me in those 5 years were things like behavior do increase when kids are engaged and kids are being successful. That's extremely important for that. They're bought in, they have hope. I can remember as an AP at Fulton sitting and talking to a student who was a freshman that I caught in the hallway and brought into my office, and I said, what are you doing? And I pulled up his grades, had all the conversation with him, and he had 0 credits in his second semester, and he said, well, my goal is to get I said, what's your goal? He said, I want to get my GED. That's what my cousin did. And I said, that's not a future for you. And so we worked with the guy, got him in with some other teachers. I remember calling Tim Irwin and saying, I'm not giving GEDs anymore. And he's like, what are you doing? He's like, you can't do that. And I'm like, I have to. I have to shut the door for anything that's distracting these kids, but for the future that we're trying to build for them. He was supportive after a little while, but we got to that. So again, we saw the increase in achievement. We saw the increase in engagement. And we also saw behaviors get better, right? That's our goal for every kid. We saw it happen. So you go, okay, I'm an old guy now. That's 15 years ago. And I'm looking and I'm saying, but I'm still encouraged because I see the same thing now. We were at Central High School a couple weeks ago, and we took the 865 CEO champions. We had all the CEOs go there to hear their stuff. And I was amazed. I didn't know these numbers. But when I heard Colin, their principal, stand up in year 2 of what they're doing, here's what he tells me. They're seeing a 24% decrease in discipline referrals in their freshman academy. I go, why? They're all together. They have a common expectation. They all put their cell phones away. Everybody has the same thing. Hall passes are lanyards that match if you're a freshman. There's nowhere to get away except for the high expectations teachers keep putting. Their teams of teachers meet every other week to talk through every kid on their list for whatever reason that is. If their grades start dropping, they talk about them. There's always a story behind the kids. And those team of teachers who are in one hallway together talk through that, and then they make interventions for those students. It may be they need to see the counselor. It may be that they need some more study time. Maybe we need to call home to those parents and connect with them, but they own and know their kids, and that's what's making the difference. So 24% decrease in discipline referrals. Their attendance is up 2.5% among their freshmen. Their failure rate in Algebra 1 is down 25% in the first 2 years of their freshman academy. And it's not just happening at Central. When we go see other schools, South Louisville, Dr. Carr is reporting the same information, same kind of trends he's seeing in his freshman academy. And when you have freshmen who are successful, guess what? You have sophomores who are successful. And now they can see the end, and they move toward that, and you stretch them. When I was at Fulton, we introduced dual enrollment classes. That was kind of new. Everybody said, well, your kids don't have the ACT to make it. I said, give me some. Talked to Anthony Wise. We started Pellissippi. We started courses there. Courses, the first one was just to get their feet wet, hold them to higher expectations. Next thing you know, these sophomores and juniors are saying, I can do college, right? Like, that's what we're doing. That's what we're trying to do across the board in every school. So I do want to say, I've lived it, and there is a connection to that, for sure, that we need to make sure we're doing what we do to get our kids academically engaged, holding them to high expectations, behaviorally and academic. I don't hide from either one of those. And I expect every principal who works for us to do the same thing. So some of these concepts of what we learned, and what we believe in from Fulton, every student's capable of success. I believe that in my heart. Every student we have, despite the background they're from, despite the times they've fallen behind, despite the times they've gotten off track, we have a way to get them there. I believe that happens by setting and maintaining high expectations, and I believe that's how we prove we love kids. I remember when we were in the middle of this Fulton experience, we used to have people like Leadership Knoxville come and they would talk, and I sat with our then superintendent and I would tell the story. And I said, we love them so much we got to kick their butts every day. And he said, man, I wish you wouldn't say that. And I said, but it's true. Because if we don't, no one cares at the end. No one cares. I always said it. No one cares if your diploma says Fulton or Farragut. In the end, UT's looking for the same kids, right? They're looking for the kids who can perform and get that done. And I think when we set a low bar, we don't love our kids well. When we think they can't, that's the message we send them. When we say you can behave like this. These are the actions that will get you further. You can achieve in these classrooms because these are the things we know will make you successful. And when we say they can't and we make excuses, and that's not the way to love them well. I believe that very much in my heart. And I also think this, when students achieve hard things, they buy in. Think about your own sake. When you've set a goal and you hit it, like there's a level of confidence that comes with that. Kind of a local one because March Madness is getting ready to start. I was reading through Dalton Connect's story. If you're a UT basketball fan, you'll know who he is. Probably going to be player of the year in all of basketball. I'm reading through his story the other day, kind of go, what made him come to Tennessee? And he talks about being 6'3" and just he's kind of a gym rat. He works and works and works at it. And then he grew to be 6'6". He's at Northern Colorado. His goal, his dad says, from when he was 10 was to play in the NBA. And he's like, well, that's probably not going to happen at 6'3", right? But he kept working at it, grew to 6'6", was a pretty good player, and then had anywhere he wanted to go with the new transfer policy. He says he knew his weakness was that he was not a good enough defender to play in the NBA, and he only wanted to talk to coaches that had a defensive background. And he came to Tennessee to learn to take care of his weakness so he's ready for the NBA. Came to Coach Barnes because his reputation, because he says, I wanted to be coached hard to be ready, right? That's extremely important, and now he's going to be National Player of the Year, probably first round of the pick of the draft is what people are saying. So I think that's very important. And I still will say this, last sentence on here, when students are bought in, engagement increases, behavior improves, and learning accelerates. I really believe that. So I want to get into a little bit of our philosophy. How does this work? What does this play out in every classroom? My expectation is playing out in every school this way. The first is we have to set and maintain high expectations. Okay, like this is a process. A lot of parents in the room, you've gone through this process with your kids too. We have to have those high expectations, not because we're being mean, but because we know what it takes to be successful at the next level. That is part of our job, to teach them academically, but also teach them right for wrong and how to do that. That doesn't just happen. Kids come from all different backgrounds. We have to do that through practice and for reinforcing those behaviors over and over. And in our schools, when we go there, I was at Austin East for half a day on Friday, I saw that happening. When I go visit schools, I was at ball camp last week, I see that happening. We can't just assume everybody knows the right thing. So we have to show them that. We have to practice that. We have to get in the line. We have to hand out papers. Those are expectations of how we want it done, not because we're trying to lord over anybody, but we're going to say these are the efficient ways that are going to make you successful in the next thing. Once we've established those and once kids have learned that, we have to hold them to those expectations. They have to be accountable for those things that happen. And I believe this one is not always popular, but we issue consequences when they're needed. That's part of the learning process. You know, I drove a little fast in college till I got my first ticket. That is part of the process. And once I had a consequence with that, it changed my behavior, right? We're always trying to align behaviors to what will make people successful on the other end. Now, we need to make sure those are fair. We have a whole system in place in Knox County Schools for that. Brian Hartzell and the work that he does there to lead that. We send, as Kori said, and she's going to go into more detail in a minute, these reports to schools all the time. Regional directors have those. We're monitoring those. Where if there's an error, if there's something that's off in the school, we spend time talking about that with them as well. So a consequence is not meant to be mean. A consequence is sometimes how we learn too. But I think the more important is the fourth bullet on here. We don't stop believing in any student. We do believe in meaningfully restoring every student back. Not if it's just one time, 2 times, 3 times. We believe in grace. I'll say that. I believe in that as a person. And I think none of us are perfect, and we have to learn those, right? So we restore you back because in the end, all 60,000 of these kids, we believe, are going to make it and need to make it. So that's very important for me that we don't skip any of those. Like these aren't there's no part of this process we can skip, and students are not widgets, right? Some of them learn just if you practice on the first time. Some are going to have a consequence. Some are going to have 2 consequences. Some are going to be moved by the fact that they're accepted back in after they have a consequence, right? We don't know when they're going to learn that, but all those things are important for that to happen. Kori's talked about this. I think our most effective strategy we have right now is that whole child, is adults coming around students, looking at the story, looking at what worked, looking at what didn't work, looking at what's going on in that student's life and making decisions. So all of those pieces fit into our philosophy around discipline. And I just want to end with this, just to show my ongoing support of this work. In 2019, school culture department was created. That was created in my division in curriculum and instruction. I'm so happy that I got to be the first person to hire who I think is a rock star, not just here in the district in the work that she does and has led and has grown the department, but Janice Cook was the first director of school culture. That was a department that we created intentionally to address any barriers to learning that happen with students, to really look at situations, look at how we could overcome those things. And I can't imagine our district without it now. I can't imagine without Janice's continued support and focus on this. I see things like de-escalation taught in classrooms. I see things like PBIS being put into classrooms. I see things like restorative practices being experienced. I saw those at Austin East when I was there on Friday as we practiced those things. This is really complex. This is not easy work. And again, kids are not widgets. So it's important for us. The ultimate goal is the academic outcomes because that's their future. And within that, we have to make sure that we're teaching right behaviors and addressing those and not skipping any of those parts. And I just want to say again before I hand this back to Kori that I really appreciate Janice's heart and her direction. She walks that line so well. I know a lot of you have experience with her. She is a lady who believes in all 3 of those stages for students to be successful, has a heart for kids like we all do in that process, and really does a great job between those. So I just wanted to say that. I wanted to go on record of just kind of explaining discipline philosophy and how we think it ties into our academics. And I'll turn back over to Kori to finish up.
All right, and so as we think about how that philosophy and how our school culture team, how our whole child support teams really are leveraging, once again, the data at our disposal. So there is a very rich set of data that we are positioning very specifically with our whole child support teams and with the schools that they are working with to ensure that every child has every opportunity to access the learning environment for the maximum extent of time possible. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do that, but before I switch to the next slide, I do want to go back to that annual action plan and what the crosswalk from our annual action plan is to this work. So for the past 2 years, we have had an objective centered on whole child support teams in the annual action plan. Last year, our goal was to establish a whole child support team at every single school. I'm not entirely sure that Janice and her team thought they could do it, but they did. So they worked hard. They worked with every single school to make sure that they had this system, they had this structure in place to identify, mitigate, and address barriers or obstacles to learning and make sure that if students did experience a consequence, they were meaningfully restored to the learning environment. This year, they went a step further. And so this year, the area of focus they've really drilled down deep on is establishing a process to leverage those whole child support teams, specifically to use the data at their disposal to identify trends and deploy school-specific supports. And so that looks like that data package comes in the form of a monthly report. So on a monthly basis, our REA team is sending out a very rich data package. It is many, many pages long to every single school. So every school principal receives this package of information. Their regional directors and supervisors receive the same package of information, and our school culture department also receives that packet. I would love to put that in front of you. That would get very, very close to student identifiable information. And so while I can't show you the reports themselves, what I can do is tell you what's in those reports. So in those monthly reports, you see a breakdown of incidents of behavior incidents in the school, broken down by frequency within given locations in the school. Are we seeing a lot of trouble in a specific hallway in the school? If so, have we concentrated supervision in that hallway? We're looking at time of day and week. Are Friday mornings rough? Probably. And so what are we doing? How are we adjusting our day in the classroom to accommodate for that, if that's a trend that we're seeing? We're looking at student demographics. We're looking at problem behavior. And the team is doing that with the intent of identifying those trends so they can deploy proactive supports and interventions so that we can intercede before behavior becomes discipline. That's the goal, right? So those monthly discipline reports are being used by those whole child support teams, again, to identify trends, to deploy supports and interventions, and most specifically to mitigate those barriers or obstacles to learning and maximize students' access to the learning environment. What I will say, again, unfortunately, I can't show you those reports. They would be blank, and so they wouldn't be super meaningful. But at our last board meeting, there was a request made for a package of data that has been distributed in the past. And so we did run that report between last month and this month. This isn't super actionable data for us at the district level simply because we have more nimble data at our disposal. We are able to look at those trends and dig into what we're seeing at a student level, at a school level. But if we take a step back and we look at what's happening at a district level, board members, you have a full packet of data in front of you, and for the community that's listening and following, we will make that packet of data available. We'll be attaching that to the board agenda this afternoon so that all of the data that's contained within that package is available. It is multiple pages, but this is a snapshot of overall out-of-school suspensions throughout the district broken down by student subgroup. And so this is a risk ratio. These aren't percentages. And so just to kind of recalibrate around what a risk ratio is, what it is we're really looking at on this screen, you're looking really for the numbers that are getting you close to 1. So the closer a number, if you see kind of at the tail end of all of those bar graphs, the numbers that are getting the closest to 1 are illustrating incidents of out-of-school suspension that are getting pretty close to parity, that are on par with the proportion of students in a given subgroup compared to their overall percentage within the entire student population. So another way of saying that is, numbers that are less than 1 illustrate incidents of out-of-school suspension that are proportionately less in a given subgroup compared to the overall student population. The flip side of that is that numbers that exceed 1 are proportionately greater. They're illustrating a proportionately greater percent of out-of-school suspensions within a given student subgroup compared to that student subgroup in the overall student population. That is the risk ratio. And again, this is probably the best way we can illustrate what's happening in the discipline space at the district level. We do prefer to dig into those very specific incidents because what we can't do in looking at this graph is say, what's going on here. We'd be taking some wild guesses, and so I'm hesitant to do that. But what we can do when we drill down a little bit deeper and we look at the school level is deploy very school-specific supports to make sure that, again, we are intervening ideally proactively and that we're restoring responsively when incidents of out-of-school suspension or other consequences are given. I would also be remiss if we didn't briefly refocus around kind of these major academic milestones that you've heard us talk about before that are really kind of our major indicators of success in the academic space. And so you hear us talk all the time about 3rd grade ELA proficiency, about 8th grade math proficiency, about our ready graduate rate throughout the district. And so because we were already looking at student subgroup, I also wanted to take a quick look at these major milestones by student subgroup as well. As you can see, our 3rd grade ELA proficiency overall in the district, 43.5%. It's a number that we're proud of. We jumped almost 5 percentage points. It's unheard of throughout the district. We're still below 50%. Right? And if you look at those individual student subgroups, we start to fall even lower than that. And this becomes incredibly important when you think back to Dr. Rysewyk and the philosophy that he laid out. If we think about those high expectations and achievement in the classroom, engagement in the classroom as being that driving force and everything else following engagement in the classroom, behavior incidents falling as I become more engaged, as I begin to see a future for myself in and beyond the classroom. This is incredibly important. So you see that again in 8th grade math, we're at 21.6% proficiency at the district level, and even lower than that in a lot of student subgroup areas. Ready graduate rate, you see numbers that are pretty reflective of our 3rd grade ELA proficiency rate. And so what does all of this mean? At the end of the day, it just means we have work to do. We have a lot of work to do at the district level. And we know that. Across those last few slides, we've illustrated that we have work to do. And we believe that we're going to give students the best possible chance for success. And we're going to continue to do this work in a deep and meaningful way by connecting the dots, by connecting our students and our staff members with the most relevant, most actionable data points to them to be able to make real-time decisions to meet their established goals at the district level, at the school level, and at the student level. So with that in mind, are there any questions about how we use data at the district level or throughout the district?
That was great. Thank you, Kori. Reverend Butler.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Kori and Superintendent Rysewyk, for the presentation and for all the work that is being done in this area. And that is one of the reasons why I really, let me say I just really love this presentation because it does do a good job of letting us know what we are doing and letting our shareholders, which I call those, since we're the board, we must have shareholders, and those that's the community, because community members pay into public schools. So they need to understand what they're getting. And this was an excellent presentation, Dr. Rysewyk. I really could relate to your slides, especially the beginning, because my family and I came to Knoxville in 2007, and we had a foster child that went to, she was in her senior year at Austin East, and my son was a 8th grader at Vine. We chose those schools to go to because they were in the community in which I served as a pastor. And I always said that I will serve and try to live in the community that I live in, or live in the community I serve in, and support that community. And so my most valuable commodities was going to those schools, and so I really wanted to see them turn around. And I think Austin East did the same. They came off the list, and their graduation rate grew greatly. And I know Project Grad had a hand in that, and they that was one of the reasons why we really enjoyed Austin East, was because of what they offered us through Project Grad, as well as all of the other things. Benny Perry was our principal, and I think you and he collaborated and talked about a lot, and that both of them came the same way. Unfortunately, we're back there again, and so we have to do something, and we're doing something. I really want to say and instead of but. I've learned that whatever you say before the but is contradicted after the but. But an and means that you're adding to it. And I really believe that you had the district level data, the school level data, the student level data, and I think you need to have a community level data. I think the community has a right, and we have a responsibility to communicate how we're doing. I do believe you showed us tonight, Dr. Rysewyk, that there is a correlation between behavior and student success. I think the data that we saw at the end shows that as well. And I think that there is a disparity in education outcome in Knox County schools. Somebody wrote an OCR complaint about it. And it's in the same range it was then. That was 2014. So 10 years later, we're still in the same place. And I know for a fact all the work that Knox County schools have done to address it, but it still hasn't made a difference. And I think we have to keep the numbers in our face to know we still have work to do. And I think, once again, the community has a right to receive this data. It doesn't mean that we're not doing our job. It just means that we still have a job to do. I also wanted to lift up the whole child support teams. And I will admit, I'm a little biased because I learned and continue to keep abreast of what is going on in that area simply because my daughter works in that area. And working on a PhD in that area as well. And so I really think that that is a major contributor to us resolving these issues. I understand the data that we receive, and I want the community to understand the data that we receive does not tell the whole story. We still see the disparity. And I'm not going to try to get on my soapbox or climb into the pulpit tonight, but I will say that that disparity we see is consistent with what we see in our community as a whole, and what we see in terms of socioeconomic standards, the rate of pay, where we live, and all of that. So our schools are pretty much a mirror of our community, our society. So I just want us to make sure that we're not going to beat up on Knox County schools because of the data, but we do need to receive the data. And that's one of the things that I think that I hear a lot of people saying, and I know that was one of the things that we were saying at the time when I was just on the outside as an advocate, but still feeling part of the solution. And I think that we definitely have to continue to do the things we're doing, because there have been some improvements in our feeder schools in District 1. We saw that the third grade level promotion data and other things. But once again, thank you for the work that's being done. I think we're on the right track, we're in the right path, but we have to keep on looking at the scoreboard so we know that how we're doing. And I think we can't be afraid of sharing the data, because hopefully 5 years from now we'll see data similar at Austin East, what we saw at Fulton, or any other school that is being challenged right now to succeed.
Thank you, Reverend Butler. Mr. Watson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't mean this sarcastically. That was worth the price of admission. I would have come to the meeting just for that. I'm not kidding. I think it was one of the better presentations that I've heard in 4 years between the two of you, because it really gets at the heart of what we do and why we do it, and also understanding how we make decisions about what we do and how we do it. Kori, that was one of the best presentations on data I've ever heard, and I've sat in a lot. I'm serious. The only thing that I would add to it, if I dare try to, is that you spoke a lot about how those indicators of success, how they, and a lot of the work that we're doing kind of push towards student outcomes. The other thing that I've learned, though, as I've had to analyze data, is that outcomes also inform backward, and they also need to inform what you do. Because at the end of the day, when you're confronted with a list of outcomes, you have a choice to make. You can first say, are we measuring the wrong thing, right? That's a choice you get to make. You also get to make the choice of, maybe we're measuring the right thing, but we're not getting the right result. And then you have to make the choice, well, why? Why am I not getting the right result? Is it because we're doing the wrong thing? That might be one thing that's happening. I don't think that's probably the case with what we've just heard. It's also to the quality in which we're doing it and the output in which we're doing it. How much of it are we doing it, right? You can do the right thing but not do enough of it, or you can do it with poor fidelity, correct? And that's why outcomes go, you need to look from the outcome backward, right? And that's the only way you can make shifts, especially when you're talking about larger systems like this. And Dr. Rysewyk, if I dare say this, we're cut a little bit from the same cloth. The reason why Restoration House has been able to work with low-income mother-led families in our community over the last 15 years and have a 75% success rate, and 100% of our moms who go back to school, getting bachelor's and master's degrees. Low-income single mothers, right? They're the ones that used to be the type, the people used to be typecast as. They're the ones that are living off the system and doing all that. Or moms who are buying first homes coming out of Restoration House. These are formerly homeless. Is for the two reasons you just said. High expectations, them absolutely believing I'm not a statistic, right? That I can do this thing. And then we mentioned a lot about whole child support here. I would say we do whole family support. We work around the whole family, top down, 2-generational. And one of the things we do a lot of is therapeutic supports. And it's hard to kind of speak to the outcome of that, but it impacts everything else, right? And the only reason I'm saying this is not to make a case for Restoration House, although if you want to check it out. It's because what you're describing is not true just in education, right? It's true in so many facets of our community in the way in which we work. I mean, one of the things that I heard that I've never forgot 20 years ago was the Pygmalion effect, which is exactly what you described, right? You hold people to high expectations. And so I really appreciate your impassioned comments around what got you to the philosophy that you have, right? Like it's lived. It's not, I read it in a magazine or I went to a great school and got a PhD. It's like, I've lived this, I've done it, right? And I appreciate that. And I would hope that anybody who's listening to tonight, their confidence would increase. And not just you, but the team that is also supporting that philosophy and that work. Reverend Butler, the comments that you made to me were, I was trying to think, how do I get to the real crux of the issue that I keep hearing brought up? Because we talked around a lot about the issue in the presentation, and I don't fault the presentation. I mean, the presentation was great. But what you said about also community level data, to me, that's the question that has yet to be answered, is what data is appropriate for the community to have access to and for the right reasons. One of the things that you mentioned was the annual report several times, and 11A on that annual report talks about whole child supports. To me, an indicator of success is discipline data related to whole child supports, right? You would have some indication of if that's successful, if you're seeing a decrease in discipline. But to me, the discipline data is not what the overarching concern of the community has been for the last 10 or 15 years. It's not discipline data by itself. It is exactly what Reverend Butler said. It is the persistent, pervasive disparities around discipline and academic data. And let me say this, that's not just true in Knoxville. I mean, you study any major city in our country, you're going to see very similar disparities in data. And those are for historical reasons. There is a history that has got us to where we are today, right, with that. And nobody believes it's going to be a quick fix. Nobody believes that it's going to be something that one administration is going to do. But I think all I've heard in the last 4 years since I've been on the board from several segments of our community is that we want to keep understanding that data so we can understand if that needle is moving, that very particular needle, which all the other things you all addressed tonight is great, right? And we need to be investing deeply at a student level and at a school level and at a district level. But there are people in our community who are concerned, and I think rightfully so, about those disparities that you're never going to understand the impact and whether or not they're changing, actually, if you just look at some of the other lower levels of data. I get why discipline data is by far most useful at a school level. Totally understand that. But that's not going to help you understand if, as a system, we are the effects of everything that we do. It's not one thing. Nobody's going to come up with one implementation, one strategy, one program that says that's going to completely eliminate our disparities, right? It's the whole of what we do, and that's the argument that you're making. It's the whole of what we do. But an indicator to understand whether or not the whole of what we do is affecting that. I think I said this in a meeting a couple years ago. I will tell you, if Knox County Schools is able to address that metric, the historical disparity metric related to academics and discipline and I will promise you there's going to be communities all across this country who come to us and say, help us figure that one out, right? Because that's been the challenge. And then, Reverend Butler, man, I'm giving lots of props tonight. The other word that you mentioned is fear, and I think that's the bottom line. I think the reason why some people don't want to talk about that data is because there's a fear of the perception of that data and what it says about us as a community and our past and all those types of things. And to me, it's like most of us, all of us in this room, were not a part of the direct violation of people's rights and oppression that got us to where we are today. But we are where we are today, and we are asked to steward where we are today, right? So nobody's trying to point the finger and blame anybody at this room or anybody in this district about why we are where we are, but we are where we are. And so there's a need to address that explicitly, and I think that's what I'm hearing in the community. Dr. Rysewyk, I believe 100% in my heart that you care about that issue. And I also believe that you feel like the philosophy that you just unpacked for us tonight will address that. I completely believe that you believe that. I actually have a lot of confidence in that too. I think that the people in the community are just saying, will you show us the data to help us understand that one particular thing, whether or not the disparities that we see in academic and disciplinary data are actually changing. I think that's all they're asking. And I do think a major factor, not from any one individual in this group, but culturally, the reason why we're not more willing to share that when we're willing to share a lot of other data is because of the fear and the perception and the belief of, I don't want to own that story. I could be wrong. But I'm going to end where I started. Props. Seriously. Best presentation in 4 years. Thank you.
Anybody? Ms. Christie.
Yeah, just to reiterate on that, that was an amazing presentation. I do love the comment that, without context, it's just a dot. And also just to speak to a little bit of what you had said, Mr. Watson, I kind of pushed back on sharing this last month, and now that I see it, I think it wasn't fear. It's just what I hear around discipline is probably very different from what you hear from my community. I mean, I do hear from a lot of parents and staff that would argue that there's not enough discipline in schools. And when you share this, and the conversation in the public becomes a big debate on whether there's too much or not enough, right? We kind of lose focus of all this great stuff that can fix it, right? The why behind it. It does become just about discipline when you bring in groups with very different viewpoints of it. So I do think we have to be careful about that. And I think we do offer a lot of supports and alternative pathways. I noticed, shout out, Dr. Wilson and Dr. Faulkner at Paul Kelly, where I forget how many of their students, 13 students earned a national industry certification from TCAT in machining this month. And that's 13 kids that weren't even on a path to graduate last year. So I do think that it's important that, like I said, it's not necessarily fear. It's more of it being a dot without having the whole story behind it as far as where I'm coming from and what I hear from people in my community.
Mr. Watson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Christie. I just want to echo what you said. I agree. I think there's lots of data that we can show in isolation that would tell not the right story. And I think that's one of the problems KCS has had and over time, and not necessarily with this administration, but acquiescing to requests for data without having the context to tell the whole story. And to me, Reverend Butler, man, I'm coming back at you, it's the and thing. To me, it's both, right? Like, to also remove that data tells a story, right? And that's the story that I think some people are hearing and asking why. What is the reason if it's not in isolation, but we're asking for it in context, why not do that? And to me, it's like a both and. Like, you need the whole story. I mean, I remember the first 2 years that I was on the board, and I was working with the Disparities in Educational Outcomes Task Force, and every meeting I was in with Bob, it was like, got to focus on academics. We've been focused on discipline too much. Got to focus on academics. And I wasn't there for that journey leading up to that, but I was like, yeah, you're right. So, I mean, and I think there was an acknowledgement of that, but it's not and only talk about one and don't talk about the other. And I think that's part of the challenge that some people are having. So.
Ms. Owen?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just thinking about data that is personally identifiable, I'd like to remind our board that while that can't be shared in a public meeting, we can certainly see that, and we can certainly reach out and ask for explanations of how that's being used very specifically. So I think it would behoove us to do that and make sure that we understand exactly how it's being used in any place that we have a concern. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions, discussions? I have to say I agree with Mr. Watson, that was the best presentation I've seen in my 4 years on the board. Thank you for sharing that with us tonight. Would y'all be okay if we take a break? A 10-minute break? Okay.